Well, good afternoon, folks. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome if you're joining on the East Coast, the afternoon, or Midwest, just top of the hour, and Pacific Coast, still the morning. But thanks so much for joining me. We'll get started here. I'm sure most of us are familiar with Zoom by now, but if you do have any questions or issues as we go forward, feel free to throw it in the chat. I'll try to keep monitoring that as we go. But I do want to welcome you to Climate Fiction for Any Classroom. My name is Seth Spencer, and I'm the Teach Climate Network Coordinator for Climate Generation. I'm coming to you from Apple Valley, Minnesota, which is the traditional and contemporary home of the Dakota and Anishinaabe people. I would love if you're able to throw in the chat your name, where you're joining from, and maybe what organization you're representing or what brings you here today. This Climate Fiction for Any Classroom workshop is the first in our 9 virtual workshop series throughout the rest of the school year. And so we are hoping to bring the best practices of climate change education to you and creating opportunities for all of us to connect with a professional community of climate change leaders and educators. I will, of course, be sharing the slide deck, links to resources, and the recordings to all workshop registrants. So thanks, folks, for throwing some information in the chat. Yeah, welcome, everybody. Appreciate that. Wonderful. Well, climate generation does start off every workshop that we do with a land acknowledgement and an acknowledgement of oppression. And so I do want to just begin that with taking time to acknowledge the native land that we are on, because one of the effects of genocide and colonization is that it can be easy to forget that we are still occupying land and that Indigenous individuals and communities are alive and leading change in our world. We recognize the tremendous resilience and innovative climate solutions that are created by these communities and seek to raise up their voices in climate change education and action. Climate Generation is proud of the incredible diversity of our country and know that our vision for an equitable future can only be achieved when people are working together, bridging experiences and expertise from across the globe. So yeah, thanks again, everybody, for joining. What the heck are we going to be doing over the next hour? So jumping into kind of climate fiction, CliFi, what is it? Are there any benefits to using it in the classroom? We'll be doing an example activity that we have found is kind of a great way to kind of jump off talking about climate fiction. We'll be going over some things to keep in mind, as there are some pitfalls we can fall into, of course, and then wrapping up with some additional resources and Q&A, of course. At this point, if you're able to turn on your videos, I always appreciate that. Love seeing faces, but I understand not all of us are in a space or a mindset that we can do that. So definitely understandable. So if this is your first time participating in a climate generation workshop, welcome. If not, hopefully you remember or know that we try to make our workshops interactive. And so this first activity or space for engagement is, what engagements do you use in your classroom, whether it be the formal classroom, informal, just kind of what engagement methods are you currently using? So I'll give you a little bit of time to think on that. And then when you have something in your mind, feel free to put it in the chat, because of course, love to share. So just give you a little time there. Yeah, thanks folks for throwing some stuff in the chat there. Yeah, and seeing lots of space for discussion, experiential learning, asking questions about prior knowledge. Wonderful. Okay, another opportunity to engage here. How do you help students connect to the content and to the classroom? I already saw some responses that answer this question as well, but I'll give you another minute or two. Yeah, stories, appeal to emotions, real life examples, talking about local issues, relating to their experience, real world issues. Perfect. Incorporate environmental justice. Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing all of that. We all hopefully know that student engagement is incredibly important for any type of retention. But I also want to talk about how student engagement during a crisis and how that possibly looks different than engagement in a classroom that we might call traditional learning time. And we know that in throughout our country, throughout North America, throughout the world, we're all dealing with different types of crisis, whether it be still dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic or school violence or climate change. Our students are bringing in a lot of emotions, and at times it can be our place to help students process some of that. So engagement, of course, has many definitions. Engagement typically lives at the kind of the confluence of the educator, the student, and kind of the content. So here you can see in this diagram, we've got spaces for relationships and relevance and competence, but really that engagement is when we're bringing all of that together. And the relationship between the educator and student and between students is incredibly important. And so these kind of three components of engagement also hold true during times of crisis. And today we're going to hopefully focus more specifically on the relationship piece and the relevance piece. And so I am seeing folks putting some additional info in the chat there. Love that. I will definitely try to follow up. And if not, we can connect back at the Q&A time. And I apologize. I might have. So art is a vehicle that moves us out of panic or apathy and gives us some catharsis. And one of those possibilities of art is climate fiction. Of course, we know that there is a lot of nonfiction out there about climate change and climate science, but today we're going to really be talking about climate fiction, as it seems to be a much easier way for students actually to connect to the material. So literature and culture forms of art like song, film, and other visual arts can inform our understanding of the world. And so we really think that literature shapes our understanding of what is normal or just or expected. And so natural and social phenomenon become known to us partly through things like stories, art, and literature. And there are texts out there that challenge readers, whether that be us as educators or students in our classrooms, to connect the dots between our lived experience and those of the character, possibly in faraway places. And that's, I think, the key piece that I've really found in working with students around climate fiction is that I live in Minnesota. I had this misconception even a few years ago that climate change was not something that was impacting Minnesota or the Midwest. It's something that happened on the coast. It was something that happened up to the polar bears in the Arctic. But I spent time in coastal Alaska and was really seeing the impacts and seeing the impact on communities and students. And then when I came back, I was like, oh, that thing I thought was not an issue is an issue. And so something like climate fiction really allows students to be like, wow, I had to change this thing that my family has done for years and years and years, kind of the phenology piece of it, of something like ice fishing or cross country skiing, or even like going camping in July, I can no longer do that because of this change. Or, there's something happening possibly in Africa, and the whole experience might not connect back to my own lived experience, but it's really important for me to be aware that there are communities that are dealing with something like climate migration, or are finding solutions like harnessing wind power to actually have electricity in a community. Now, I think it is really important to talk about. There are a couple of different types of climate fiction. One that I think probably existed for a long time, just in fiction in general, is this kind of utopic climate fiction of like, okay, something's going to happen and life's going to be really great and we'll be all good. But there's a lot more dystopia climate fiction out there now of, if we don't change, this will happen. And it's really important for, again, us as educators to be aware of the text that we're choosing, of how is that going to come out and what emotions might our students go through in actually reading that. Because there are some really great kind of texts out there for, if we all come together as a community, this is something that could happen. But there's also a lot of Hollywood is really great about showing us what will happen if we don't change something. There are a lot of kind of climate disaster movies out there. And of course, we want to make sure that we're not adding trauma to our students' lives, but really making sure that we're using that text in an appropriate way, of course. So it's also kind of important to really think about climate fiction, that it's in the future. And when I say, or is it, if we take action, maybe it doesn't have to be the way that many of our authors out there are writing this kind of dystopia around climate change, and how that shows up for characters 10 years from now or hundreds of years from now. And I think this is true for fiction, but also climate fiction. It can be really a mirror. So really allowing our students to look and say, is this character like me? How does the character's actions or my actions actually have an impact on others? And how would I react in a similar situation? And so again, you'll see some links here. I'll share the link to this slide deck in just a few moments. And of course, I'll send that in a follow-up email. But, and as I mentioned, if you have any questions, we're going to definitely throw it in the chat. So climate fiction, or fiction in general, can be a window. So how am I like this other person? How are we affected, or are we affected in the same way? And really, how do we kind of adapt to the challenge? And so again, you'll see some examples of climate fiction that educators in our Teach Climate Network have used, and that we've had a chance to poke into. And climate fiction can really create inspiration. So probably one of the most well-known texts that we share is The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. And so an example of taking an impact around climate change and really finding a solution, and allowing students to kind of see that we can, as individuals or as communities, have an impact or a reaction to climate change. And so we're already at another time to have some interaction. In just a minute, I'm going to be sending you all into breakout rooms. And this is another great time, if you're able to come on screen, introduce yourselves to the other folks. Yes, it is. Thanks, Lisa. And so that's also another thing. So there's climate fiction, climate nonfiction. And I think just another great example. And yeah, I appreciate that. That is actually based on a true story, and is now in film version. But in these breakout rooms, what I'm going to kind of challenge you to do is, again, introduce yourselves, but also I'll be sharing some quotes from some climate fiction. And I want you to just, as a group, kind of read through them, process them a little bit, and kind of take turns answering these questions. How does the quote make you feel? Why does the quote make you feel this way? How does the quote connect to climate change concepts? And what technique does the author use to make this connection? And we will be having some time to come back in a larger group and have another chance to interact. But I'll go ahead and throw the link to the slide deck so that you all have it here in the chat. So I'll give folks just a second. I'm going to stop screen sharing to kind of pop in there. Yeah, thanks everybody. So right now I'm on slide 16, but the quotes are going to be on slide 17 and 18. And then there is kind of a feelings wheel on slide 19 if you need a little help actually finding the word that might come up. But I'm also going to throw in those questions that I just asked you to kind of think about. So here are the prompts. And there might be somebody in your room that might not have the link. If you're able to share the link to any of that, that'd be great, or the prompt. But I'm going to send folks into a breakout room here in just a second. We'll have about 15 minutes. So I'm going to have you kind of try to wrap up at 30 minutes after the hour. If things aren't working, there's not a conversation, you need any help, feel free to come back to the main room. But otherwise, I'll see you here in about 15 minutes. I'm just going to create those breakout rooms. I definitely understand you there, Alicia. I almost always leave the breakout room a little early, so no worries. Yeah, I think we've got everybody back now. Thanks so much, folks, for participating in those breakout rooms and processing a little bit and thinking through some of those quotes. I know that can be challenging, definitely sharing with folks you might not be familiar with. We are going to keep going, but we'll still be thinking through those quotes a little bit, kind of as a larger group. Hopefully you're still able to see my screen. I'm trying to just share part of it so that we can still see when we edit these slides, which you can't really do in slideshow mode. But I think we'll keep going here. So kind of as a large group, I'm going to give folks an opportunity to kind of, what were you thinking or feeling with some emojis when you first read through that quote? So I'll give folks a few seconds here to hopefully I can notice when. So again, we're right now on slide 20. I apologize. We're on slide 20. And I'll throw the link to this slide deck back up. Okay, I'm seeing some emojis moving in the slide deck. That's great. Thanks, Susie, for throwing it in the Zoom chat. Yeah. Yeah, you can throw it kind of wherever. If you want to throw it in the actual Google slide on slide 20, you should be able to do that. So yeah, definitely feeling some pain there, some frustration, some sickness. I'll give folks a few more seconds here to kind of react. Yeah, some anger. And I think as I mentioned earlier, it's important for us to, as educators, identify that we're having these emotions because students probably are having these emotions too when we're reading through, whether it be climate fiction, nonfiction, just any text. And while we can't maybe open the space for every student to process everything they're thinking, I think it's, again, important for us to say, okay, we just read this really disturbing text. What are we going to maybe do about it? How are we going to have a conversation about it? Is there action opportunities? And I think that's a piece that is really important, is to just like, what is something a student could do to kind of process through that emotion? So we're going to move to slide 21, which is this large group share out. And so I'm just, if you have an opportunity, just throw a word or two of like, why does this matter? What does this have to do with climate change? So I'll give you an opportunity. I know we just had somebody join us, so I'm going to throw that slide deck back in, that link in the chat. And so right now we're just processing through slide 21, reacting to a quote. Yeah. So definitely, unfortunately, this is already happening. Feeling of hopelessness. Yeah, more severe storms as a result of climate change. Uh, so vulnerable, happening to people least responsible for the carbon emissions, definitely. The effects include the mental health toll that folks take on. Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Johan, you just mentioned in the chat, that there are parts of the world that are either already here, nearly here, and then there's other parts of the world that it's pretty easy for us to put our blinders on and think everything's totally normal, everything's totally okay. And also know that our students probably, there's definitely folks that are having the mental health kind of angst, but also there's folks that are like, there's no change to my daily life, so why does it matter? Great, thanks so much for throwing some things in there. I do want to make sure we've got some time to keep chatting, so we're going to go to slide 22 and just process that second quote. And I know not everybody was able to get maybe to this one in their group, but I'll just kind of read it out loud. Can you believe that used to be a mountaintop that had birds and deer and foxes and a million trees on it? Mama said that if a place has coal and poor people, then the coal companies will take it out any way they can and don't care what happens to people. From Same Sun Here. Yeah, I'll give folks another chance to react with emojis. Yeah, some sadness, some anger. Yeah, definitely some frustration there at some of the inequities around climate justice and climate change. So yeah, we're going to move to slide 23 and just again, an opportunity to react in a word or two. Hillary, I'm not sure if I know your exact question of moving and writing back in the original Google slide, but I can put the slide deck. You should be able to, within on this slide 23, be able to drag the actual quote box and be able to just dead center of that, put in some text. With the emojis, you should be able to drag it, but I know every computer is different, and I have found that if I've not updated Zoom in a while, it doesn't work the way I want it to. So I do apologize if anybody's dealing with some tech issues. I know that can be frustrating. So yeah, I'm seeing some responses here. Appreciate it. Fear, corporate greed, Stone Age, loss of local ecology. An excellent point. When will climate justice movement stop being so polite and maybe just call out what's really happening? Yeah. Mountaintop has actually come to Florida to coal burning power plant. Intergenerational issue. Economic is such a key part of any climate change solution. It's pretty hard for us to demand solution or change or action if folks are struggling to get by on the day to day. Well, thank you so much for interacting with those. We'll leave it here as kind of a resource. As again, I'll make sure to send out the slide deck to everybody. Yeah, definitely a just transition. Appreciate that. So I'm going to just keep moving on here as we've got a few more slides and definitely want to have some time for questions and sharing. So again, back to kind of what's the benefit of literature and how does it actually help build classroom community? Well, as you can see, it allows us to explore and focus on student identity, helps us to get to know our students. I think that's such a huge part of it, again, their shared experience. Let students get to know each other and bring their own experience. and supports discussion about difficult concepts and truth that students might not have the language or sometimes the emotion to be able to share. So, what are some possibilities or ways to actually use fiction in the classroom? I'm sure you all have much more experience doing this, but if you've got something that has worked, feel free to throw it in the chat. But you can see here um, book club discussion groups, posters or presentations. And these are some of these are tried and true methods. Some of them might not work for your classroom. Definitely understand that. But read and pair share or small group discussions. Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Read alouds, gallery walks and guided discussion of quotes and short poems. Posters or any type of art just allows students to kind of process their emotion. Some students love it. Some students, it's their nightmare having to share anything they've drawn, but I think it's just an important way for students to have another way to kind of express what they're thinking about. Yeah, contact the author. Awesome. Thanks, Julia. Yeah, thanks everybody for sharing. So now we're on to the kind of some important reminders. We just saw that some of the emotions that can come up when reading about dystopian climate fiction. And so I think it's just important for us to think about kind of who is showing up in our any of our books, but definitely in our fiction. So we can look at now 5-year-old data, but still fairly relevant from the Cooperative Children's Book Center from the UW-Madison, and see that in 2018, 50% of characters in the children's books that they reviewed were white, while 10% were Black, 7% were Asian Pacific Islander or Asian Pacific American, 5% were Latino, and 1% were Indigenous or First Nations. And so just that representation piece is so key. So it's important for us to think about the text that we're choosing. Now, a little bit more updated data just last year, and they did another review of text. I think it's important. I think these were all sent to them, so maybe a little different, but now 40% of the books that reviewed had at least one Black, Indigenous, or person of color as a primary character in both fiction and nonfiction. So I share that to kind of make it relevant to our lived experiences as educators now. Because unfortunately, it's sadly relevant to discuss what books we as educators are even able to bring into our classrooms, especially if it's in the formal public education sector. So we're not currently seeing maybe a wave of book banning specifically about climate fiction. I guess I haven't seen that pop up in the news, but we note that 30% of books that have been banned over the last 2 years have been about race, racism, or characters of color, and 25% had LGBTQ plus characters or themes. And so I probably am missing a few states, but we know that there have been book bannings in Texas, Florida, Missouri, Utah, South Carolina. Here in Minnesota, it has popped up on some school districts across the state. So I don't share all that to completely bum you out, but challenge all of us to be aware of what we're sharing with our students and how we can really make sure we're being relevant to their identities and to the identities of kind of everyone that make up our communities. And so here are just some questions to keep in mind when we're kind of looking. So are we including people of different races, genders, ages, and classes? Does the illustrator draw people in ways that look respectful? Are their characters portrayed as powerless? And if so, what identities do they hold? Does the identity of the text author support the inclusion of diverse voices? and again, this is another task as an educator to kind of like, oh man, these are some deep questions to really think about. And of course, there's lots of resources out there, but again, as we're kind of stepping into what can be a challenging kind of idea, especially if the concepts that come up in the climate fiction are new to our students. Of course, that's going to be shared back in their families, and so it's important for us to kind of think through some potential challenges that might come up. Okay, so we've had some great conversation, but of course, always want to share some resources. And so, one that I, of course, want to highlight is one from Climate Generation, which is our climate fiction and nonfiction reading guide that was just updated last year. Again, I can put that here, direct link here in the chat, but I will make sure to send all of that in a follow up email. But just this resource had a few updates. One is just the importance of climate fiction and its relationship to climate justice. Addition of elementary level picture books. New books were added, of course, and then of course the all helpful appendix. Yeah. And then along with that, is our Teach Climate Network, which this is a part of. The Teach Climate Network is just Climate Generation's way of connecting with educators across North America and really being able to share resources, whether that's our monthly newsletter that has, again, resources, tips, general conversation, these monthly workshops, and then that all kind of culminates in what we call our Summer Institute for Climate Change Education, which is a virtual institute. It has happened the last 4 or 5 years in mid-July. We might be adjusting when that happens in 2024, but we'll definitely be having that. And do want to leave folks with a long quote, but a good one from David Sobel here. And I'll just read a part of it out loud. Perhaps the most or more compelling and historically consistent feature of dystopian fiction is the hero's quest. Faced with an unimaginable tragedy, there is a character who rises to the challenges and faces unbeatable odds. And so, if we want to avoid the environmental catastrophes and repressive governments pictured in current dystopian fiction, we're going to need more adolescents willing to be heroic. We need heroic behavior, not just in the arena, but in our everyday lives, at work, and in school. And we need students and community members who dare to challenge the social order. If these other heroines and compel us to be heroic, then perhaps these books are part of the solution. And so with that, I'm going to stop talking, as I know I've been sharing a lot of information, but definitely want to open it up to questions that folks might have, thoughts about what has worked. Yeah. And I will definitely try to follow up on anything that I might have missed in the chat. Yeah, Sue, I'm going to stop sharing here. I'll try to see if I can find a specific link. I wonder also if you're thinking of another organization called Subject to Climate, which I can throw in here, as Subject to Climate has what I believe is like an actual searchable for like K-12, but I'll find both links here. And if anybody does have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or unmute yourself, as I'll try to follow up with a couple links. The first is going to be Climate Generation's kind of resource page that has like our, and I apologize if something just got bumped, but yeah, thanks, Paul. I'll throw that Subject to Climate link in here. Yeah. And maybe I'll put in one more resource, which is the Clean Network, committed to climate and energy education. They've got also some great resources. But as I said, I'll make sure to include these in a follow-up email. Well, again, thanks so much for taking the time. Yeah, go ahead, Julia.
Oh, sorry, if people are ready to hop off. I just have a conundrum with all this dystopian fiction. That quote you just read, it's interesting that it sort of presents these heroic adolescents as models, because I feel like those kinds of books are unreachable. Like they for most teenagers or middle schoolers, they it just feels like, oh, I could never be that kind of person. I could never be like a Greta Thunberg, or like one of these fictional characters. And so I have been on my own quest for utopian climate fiction that really portrays positive futures despite climate change, and or in the climate solutions woven into fiction. And I'm having really hard time finding examples. And I'm eager to look at your climate resource, the link you just posted about fiction. And I assume it's an annotated list, because I just feel like I found a couple short stories here and there, but nothing that really allows us to imagine a future where climate change has happened, like, 20, 30 years in the future, but is positive. It's all just like a few pockets of people learning to live with these horrendous conditions. So I'm just curious if other people have found things like that, or ways to approach the dystopian fiction in ways that are not just thoroughly unattainable for the average teenager who's like, well, I'm not a hero.
Yeah, thanks so much, Julia. Sue, I see you're gonna respond to that. I'm just quickly writing down this note so that I can follow up with you, Julia, on some of those resources. But yeah, I'll turn it over to you, Sue.
Yeah, so I'm writing what we call a collaborative storytelling adventure to do exactly what you're talking about, Julia. And basically, it is saying that by the year 2030, we've won all of the global goals from the United Nations. What is it like to be in that situation, and what did we do to make that happen? And then going into the year 2050 and saying, all right, where the world is celebrating the Earth's temperature coming back down. What is that like, and what did we do to make that happen? And drawing on all the positive things that we know of that are out there, whether it's in a fiction yet or not. We want to make those part of our climate story. And so I'm going to invite all of you to help write this story. And I'll work through Seth and see if we can't be part of a really hopeful and helpful climate story.
Well, that is wonderful to hear, Sue. And yeah, I'll definitely happy to share resources from other folks. I'll make sure that I review the chat to see that I didn't miss anything. But yeah, and I'll make sure to follow up with some possibly other resources, Julia. I'll definitely keep it open if anybody has anything, but I also understand if folks need to step away. And yeah, I really hope that you can join us. I completely forgot to highlight our next workshop, which is on climate storytelling and how to engage youth in climate storytelling on Wednesday, October 4th at 4 p.m. And I will get that link right now. And I completely space on editing that, and I'll make sure to throw it in the slide deck. But yeah, thanks, everybody. And I'll find that direct Zoom link if folks want to register for that. Yeah, thanks, Lisa, for those hashtags as well. Oh, wonderful. Thanks, Johan.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Seth, I can send you, I haven't got the link handy, but I'll send you the resource links, and then you can share them out with your mail out if you think it's appropriate.
That sounds perfect. Yeah, I think I'm going to go ahead and stop recording, but happy to stay.